Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I am Maria Gonzalez with SBP. We have a large group, so please mute your mics throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the Q&A box and we will respond at the end. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. We will send the slides from today's presentation later, so look out for them in your inbox or spam folder. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we have partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: building efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. We have our next event, which will take place next month, September 17th through the 18th. That's our disaster housing course. This course has many key topics to equip leaders to be effective and efficient construction managers. It covers multiple aspects of pre-construction, construction, and post-construction processes that effectively repair or replace damaged housing caused by disasters. Please note this course is sold on a per seat basis. And as you can see on the screen, the prices are on there right on the right side of the screen. For nonprofit agency is $1,500, government $2,000, and for-profit $3,000. If you're interested or you have any questions, you can scan the QR code on the screen or register by just clicking on the link, or you could send me a message to the advise@sbpusa.org, and I will respond to any questions that you may have. We also have 2 upcoming courses thanks to a generous grant from the Walmart Foundation. If you are interested, again, you can send me an email at advise@sbpusa.org or scan the QR code. But the 2 that we will be having, one is in October. That's the Disaster Recovery Leader Practitioner course. And in November 5th through the 7th, it's our Response to Recovery Leader Practitioner course. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Following us on LinkedIn and Facebook is one of the simplest ways to stay updated on what the Advise team is up to on social media. We encourage you to connect with us. Now I will pass it over to our disaster recovery advisor, Joshua Bryant.
Hey, good morning, and thank you, Maria. As mentioned, my name is Joshua Bryant, and I joined SBP in January as a disaster recovery advisor. Before joining SBP, I served as the recovery division chief for the Texas Division of Emergency Management, where I was responsible for the disaster declaration process, securing federal disaster funding, and managing multi-billion-dollar disaster grants. Today's webinar, I will be providing a high-level overview of the federal mitigation programs and best practices within mitigation and resilience. This webinar is to provide awareness level information, but we are happy to work with any of you in the future to answer any detailed questions or provide more information about these programs. Additionally, if you have questions specifically during today's webinar, please type them in the chat feature and we will address them at the end of today's session. Next slide, please. All right, today's agenda includes 3 primary topic areas. First, we will review recent disaster trends and why recent trends highlight that proactive mitigation is essential not only to protect lives and property, but also to ensure economic and environmental stability in the face of increasing disaster risk. Second, we will summarize mitigation opportunities and highlight best practices for consideration under each opportunity. And then finally, we'll highlight other resources for assistance that may exist outside of traditional federal funding opportunities. Next slide, please. In our experience, the best way to begin a webinar is with why this topic is important. And so I do want to talk a little bit about recent disaster trends that underscore the growing importance of mitigation. This is an importance for several reasons. Nationwide, citizens, first responders, governments, and nonprofits are generally exhausted from the repetitive cycle of disaster impacts. Um, Community capacity and financial stressors weigh heavily on disaster impacted communities. And the complex nature of disaster recovery programs leave many decision makers burdened and able to reach their communities and return them back to a sense of normal following disaster. Next slide, please. The scope and scale of disasters seems to be changing nationwide. Wildfires are burning in places that historically not experienced a fire threat. I think the Louisiana wetlands areas in Hawaii and record-breaking temperatures and droughts have caused hundreds of millions in damages in other parts of the countries, while the same places may receive relentless rainfall, causing repetitive flooding in communities during different seasons. Additionally, the frequency of billion-dollar disasters and the severity of disasters in the U.S. has increased dramatically over the last 40 years. In the next slide, I will show a chart that highlights this example. Maria, if you'll move to the next slide, please. Okay, so from 1983 to 2002, there were $96 billion disasters causing over $546 billion in damages. Um, and if you look at the following 20-year period, that number increased from 96 to 244 events, which caused over $1.9 trillion in disaster damage costs from the 2003 to 2022 timeframe. This represents a 154% rise in cost, and these are just federal disaster dollar costs. Next slide, please. The federal government has increased spending more and has spent more often on providing disaster aid to impacted communities. Of the 4,885 plus disaster declarations that have been declared in the Stafford Act, more than half of these have been designated as a major disaster. It is reported that FEMA has paid over 135 billion in public assistance funds and over 90 billion individual assistance funds since both of those programs have been accepted. And additionally, every single county or parish in the United States has been declared under a federal disaster declaration at least once since 1953. Next slide, please. Under HUD's community development block grant programs for disaster recovery, 10 states and territories alone have received over 93 billion in recovery allocations since 2001, with more allocations anticipated in the coming months. All of these trends appear to be moving up and to the right of the chart. So with this in mind, we are left with the question of what to do and basically how to address these problems. Next slide, please. The primary question of how can communities across the country begin to slow or reverse natural disaster impacts to their communities, and how do we better protect lives, property, and ensure economic stability and environmental resilience in the face of increased disaster risk. Next slide, please. Coupled with preparedness, strong communication, and general situational awareness of the populace, along with sufficient insurance coverages, communities must begin expanding mitigation resilience efforts within their jurisdictions. So throughout the next few slides, I want to summarize where these efforts and opportunities exist and then highlight some of the best practices for consideration under each opportunity. Next slide, please. So to begin, what is hazard mitigation? There are a few different definitions found in federal programs and policies, but generally, hazard mitigation describes any activity that increases resilience to disasters and reduces or eliminates long term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to, and loss of property, as well as suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. The goal of these efforts is to break the repetitive cycles and ultimately reduce disaster costs and impacts of future disasters by either building more resiliently or basically negating the impacts of hazards to communities. Excellent, please. Mitigation efforts can come in many forms. Uh, some are complex, some are easy, some are expensive, others are inexpensive. And sometimes these efforts may take years to implement, while other mitigation efforts may be able to be completed within a few days. I'm going to speak about all of these types of examples, but regardless of which mitigation effort you are pursuing, the starting line is generally the same. Next slide, please. And that starting line is to start with a plan. Effective mitigation planning helps to identify potential hazards and access vulnerabilities within a community by understanding what the risks are, where they exist, and where weaknesses lie. Communities and stakeholders can prioritize and implement measures that address the most pressing issues. Mitigation planning allows for the allocation of resources in a strategic manner. It helps determine which mitigation actions will have the greatest impact um, and how communities can use their resources more effectively and avoid wasteful spending on less critical areas. Um, Planning supports long term vision by integrating risk reduction into community development. And it fosters coordination and collaboration across many different stakeholders within the whole community. Next slide, please. Additionally, many of the funding opportunities and regulatory um, requirements for federal mitigation programs will require a hazard mitigation plan to be in place. Having a plan ensures eligibility for these grants and supports and demonstrates the community's commitment to proactive risk management. This is specifically true for the majority of FEMA and HUD programs that we will discuss shortly. By investing in mitigation measures before a disaster occurs, communities can reduce future costs associated with response and recovery efforts. And effective planning helps to minimize damage by saving money in the long run. Next slide, please. Benefits to state and local governments are immense from the planning process, which provides a structured approach to decision making, offering a clear set of guidelines and priorities. And it helps to ensure that mitigation efforts are evidence based and aligned with the community's goals and needs. As environmental, social, and economic conditions evolve, planning helps communities adapt to new challenges and its changing risk profiles. This adaptability ensures that mitigation strategies remain relevant and effective in the future. Next slide, please. Some general planning considerations and best practices include conducting a thorough risk assessment of your community, where you help to identify and understand specific vulnerabilities. Uh, Another best practice would be to prioritize actions that would be most effective in reducing long-term risk. So think 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road and not just uh, the next disaster season or the next disaster cycle. Um, Engage community experts throughout the planning process. Good examples of this would be researchers from local universities, business owners, faith-based organizations, or maybe people that have just been in the community for a long time and understand the different seasons and impacts that a disaster um, may cause. Um, Using GIS and mapping tools to help visualize risk and understand where focus areas should be. Identify and create multi-level funding opportunities. So do not just rely on federal funding or state funding for mitigation opportunities, but try to expand your funding opportunities to the best of your community's ability. And then really track and uh, plan implementation in order to learn from planning mistakes or how a mitigation strategy may evolve into the future, um, and update your plan periodically to ensure that you're tracking and documenting those improvements. Next slide, please. And then finally, we talked a little bit earlier about involving the whole community, but planning processes often involve community engagement. And the broader that you can make that community engagement, the more risk awareness that you will have in the community when a disaster strikes. This planning process really promotes public involvement in mitigation efforts, as well as helps to build a culture of preparedness and resilience, so people are aware of the hazards that face their communities. Next slide, please. Once your mitigation plan is written or revised, it is time to begin funding, designing, and building mitigation projects. Uh, by federal definition, meaning primarily FEMA or HUD programs, a mitigation project is a competitively awarded financial assistance project for applicants, which are generally state or local governments, to implement cost effective mitigation projects designed to increase resilience and public safety and to reduce injury, loss of life, and the damage and destruction of property, which includes damage to critical services and facilities. Next slide, please. There are multiple governmental and non-governmental organizations that either have grant programs available or offer technical assistance to local governments and communities to assist in funding or pursuing funding for mitigation activities. Three specific examples that I will talk about today are FEMA's hazard mitigation opportunities under the Stafford Act, HUD's Community Development Block Grant, mitigation, also known as CDBG MIT. And then finally, I briefly want to tell you about SPP's Fellows Program, which is an example of technical assistance and surge capacity that may be available to communities to help with mitigation opportunities. Next slide, please. So to begin with FEMA and their programs, the Stafford Act includes several provisions related to hazard mitigation. These typically come with local cost shares are administered through state pass-through entities. So generally that would be your state emergency management agency or a state resilience office. Some FEMA programs are considered competitive grant awards. Others are only available to specific applicants. And I'll talk about both of those shortly. And additionally, FEMA's programs offer opportunities for both pre-disaster and post-disaster mitigation efforts, which I'll also hit on. Um, these these are fairly broad-reaching, meaning they're available nationwide to different levels of government. But there are a few specific areas that I want to highlight before we move to best practices. Next slide, please. The first area is FEMA's 406 mitigation program, also known as public assistance mitigation. So in addition to the funds received under the public assistance program, for the recovery of cost, meaning if you have a eligible facility damage during disaster, FEMA's PA program may pay to help rebuild that facility. FEMA does allow some PA funding specifically for mitigation measures that directly reduce the potential of future damage to the disaster damage portion of that specific facility. So an example with this would be if you had a public library damaged during a disaster, then it's possible that FEMA PA dollars could cover some resilience cost in order to make that specific facility more resilient to future disaster damages. This program is not competitive with other applicants and does not have a set funding cap across the entire program. However, FEMA PA mitigation measures must be technically feasible and be cost effective and demonstrated through an acceptable benefit cost analysis. The downside to FEMA's PA mitigation program is that it may delay project eligibility determinations. So applicants should begin planning for and communicating PA mitigation efforts to their FEMA PD&G as soon as possible during the recovery process. Next slide, please. Next, FEMA's marquee grant programs that focus around mitigation include pre and post disaster mitigation grants. Starting with post disaster mitigation grants, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which will also group the HMGP post fire grant into this category, authorizes FEMA to provide hazard mitigation assistance following a disaster declaration. These grants aim to reduce the risk of future damage, hardship, loss, and suffering to any area affected by a disaster and are considered non-competitive grants. However, these are all administered through a state pass-through entity, and often there's a greater demand for mitigation funding than there is funds available under that grant. Next, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, or also referred to as DARA, redefined the pre-disaster mitigation programs that FEMA historically managed. And these programs are now not subject to an annual appropriation from Congress. The FEMA BRIC and FMA programs aim to promote proactive mitigation efforts before a disaster occurs, and these are considered competitive nationwide grants. For all four categories, a strong mitigation plan as well as well-developed mitigation project applications are the baseline keys to success to obtaining these funding opportunities. Next slide, please. Moving to best practices for FEMA mitigation considerations. Best practices may include aligning project applications with state and local approved hazard mitigation plans, conforming to the latest relevant consensus-based codes and standards, specifications, and building standards within your community. Submitting a project application that solves a problem independently or is at least part of a functional long-term solution for a problem. It's a best practice to leverage funding to mitigate against specific disasters. And then finally, incorporating a forward-looking approach during the disaster recovery process is considered the best time to consider mitigation actions. And like a timeline, the best time to protect a facility from a future disaster, similar to the damage that just occurred during a recent disaster, is when the cost benefit analysis, technical feasibility, and the effectiveness are most evident, which would be after the disaster immediately occurred. Next slide, please. Next, I want to briefly talk about HUD's community development block grants, mitigation funds, or the CDBG MIT programs. CDBG MIT aims to build resilience, support, uh, and uh, and mitigation efforts for vulnerable communities. It aims to enhance long-term recovery, promote innovation, and foster sustainable development, and encourage comprehensive planning to effectively address and mitigate against disaster risk. This is accomplished through four primary goals. The first is by supporting data-informed investments, focusing on repetitive loss of property and critical infrastructure. Next is building capacity to comprehensively analyze disaster risk and then update hazard mitigation plans accordingly. Next is supporting the adoption of policies that will have long-lasting effects on community risk reduction. And then finally, maximizing the impact of funds by encouraging the leveraging of private and public partnerships in coordination with other federal dollars, such as FEMA mitigation programs. Next slide, please. HUD provides flexible grants to help local governments, states, and tribes to mitigate the risk of future disasters, especially and specifically in low and moderate income areas. And this is subject to the availability of supplemental appropriations from Congress. Eligible activities include outreach and education efforts associated with mitigation activities, and may be used in areas impacted by recent disasters to carry out strategic and high impact activities that mitigate disaster risk. Activities may include infrastructure improvements, property acquisition and relocation, building and facility improvements, public service education, environmental improvements, planning and capacity building, technology and data management, and economic revitalization. Next slide, please. Some general CDBG MIT considerations and best practices include making data driven decisions using hazard data, disaster declaration data, and demographic data. Ensure alignment with broader mitigation goals and regulations. Choosing projects based on their potential impact, cost effectiveness, and alignment with community needs. And then finally, keeping the public informed and promoting transparency of programs, allocations, and projects. The last one is chiefly important because CDBG programs can last many, many years following a disaster, and making sure that the public is aware of a community's continual work to improvement following a disaster is key to ensuring that community support is sustained throughout that long period. Next slide, please. And then finally, as we wrap up, I wanted to leave you with a few additional resources that may assist your community with pursuing mitigation efforts and resilience programs. Next slide. Two semi-recent pieces of legislation from the 2021-2022 timeframe are the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and both contain funding opportunities for mitigation and resilience programs. The Inflation Reduction Act provides significant opportunities for enhancing resilience across various sectors, but are particularly interested in sectors in relation to climate change and ecosystem management. And then the bipartisan infrastructure law includes several provisions aimed at enhancing resilience and mitigation, particularly in the context of climate change and infrastructure. So now agencies like the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency have grant opportunities available to assist with mitigation projects and community resilience efforts. I wanted to highlight this because as you're looking for funding opportunities to include in your mitigation plans, don't just consider the traditional FEMA programs. There are many other federal programs that provide funding for this type of work that you should explore through grants.gov or by working with your state resilience or emergency management office to understand what may qualify as potential assistance under these programs. Next slide, please. And then finally, I want to mention that mitigation efforts do not have to come from government funding sources explicitly, or they do not have to be administered by state or local officials. Next slide. Community leaders should encourage their citizens to reduce long-term risks for themselves, to both promote their properties, to both protect their properties and their personal belongings in the face of disaster. Traditionally, strong insurance and preparedness are good tactics to being disaster ready, but there are some things that you can do to incorporate risk reduction techniques into your homes and businesses. Things like strengthening roofs against wind hazards, elevating utilities like your water heater, clearing vegetation and combustible materials around your home, and then installing proper drainage systems to manage heavy rainfall may help prevent flooding. Some of these things can be accomplished over a long weekend and may cost next to nothing. Others may be bigger projects, but you may be able to offset the cost and time of these projects by saving on insurance, or at least having some kind of psychological safety as disaster approaches. Next slide, please. And then finally, we understand at SBP that these programs can be hard to navigate. Mitigation projects can be costly, and communities may struggle to allocate funds for these initiatives. We know that budget constraints and competing priorities make it challenging to invest in long-term mitigation measures. And communities often have multiple needs and priorities, such as education, healthcare, economic development. Technical feasibility within these programs is hard to come by just because they're not super common sense, and it is not a broad career field that people become experts in mitigation and resilience techniques. However, there are organizations that offer all levels of support that your community could and should pursue. Everything from federal and state agencies down to nonprofit organizations offer different levels of funding and assistance to help meet unmet needs in mitigation. And I do want to highlight some of SBP's specific efforts through the Fellows Program, which is where we have placed staff members across the country uh, funded by generous grants from corporate partners. And these fellows are placed in communities to add capacity to train and to look for funding opportunities specific to their placement communities. During the initial round, three fellows specifically were able to influence an additional $55 million in recovery and resilience funding for their placement communities within a 1 year time frame. And so there's definitely a precedence for success out there. Next slide, please. If you're interested in learning more about this specific program or you need help with questions about recovery and resilience activities, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at jbryant at sbp.us or sorry at sbpusa.org. Again, that's jbryant sbpusa.org. I appreciate your participation this morning, and I will answer any questions or pass the presentation back to Maria.
Thank you so much, Josh. I don't see any Q&A, any questions in the Q&A box. But again, as Josh said, if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Okay, so don't forget to register for our upcoming course, our disaster housing course, which will be held next month in Savannah, Georgia. And our other two things to the Walmart Foundation in October and November. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to one of us. We do have some offerings here. If you do have any questions or you're interested in learning more about our offerings, please reach out to us at advise@sbpusa.org, or you can visit our resource hub page. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We look forward to meeting with you on future in-person courses. We will email today's slide deck, so look out for that in your inbox. Thank you again on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation. Have a great rest of your day.